I'm going to try to do health in 5 minutes. So obviously I couldn't cover this very complex topic, but I'm going to try to take a stab at it, at least at how I've been looking at it over the course of the past few years, and I should say past 2 decades. And it is colored by my experience, which is primarily in clinical trials and drug development, both at the level of academia and industry, where I was CSO of a large public-private partnership with UCSF and worked with almost all of the major biotech and pharmaceutical companies developing very, very cutting-edge drugs and biomarkers to try to understand why drugs worked or didn't work, and doing a lot of patient subset analysis starting back in the 90s. And then as the Chief Innovation Officer for the first term of the Obama administration, where I worked directly with the FDA Commissioner, trying to really understand how we innovate in this industry, including adaptive licensing, actually. Worked a lot and published on that issue, and how healthcare reform was going to impact not just point-of-care health, but the tools that we use, which I think often get lost in the conversation about healthcare reform. So I think one of the big issues is this sort of dichotomy and this very weird place that exists between being a patient and a consumer. And as soon as we walk into the doctor's office, for those moments that we're there, we're a patient. If we get diagnosed with something, our whole life changes and we're a patient. But then we walk out the door and somehow we're this person back in our consumer life, but we now have this profound thing that's happened to us that redefines us as a patient. And that's not a pleasant redefinition. It's actually quite an unpleasant one for most people. They don't enjoy being patients. They don't want to be in the hospital, and they certainly don't want to be sick. And so for them, there are a couple of really key components that I think we need to focus on. One is transparency. And the system has not really been terrific with respect to being transparent as a medical community to patients in their everyday consumer life. The second is we know there's transactions that are going on all over the place in the consumer life that have a profound impact on the patient life, and yet we aren't really marrying those, in large part because the patient experience is a very short window of time in clinic, but most of the action about what's actually going to impact the efficacy of your care is not happening in clinic, except in acute care management. And then there's trust, and this is a huge issue in patient management and healthcare, not just patient privacy, and I spend a lot of time thinking about HIPAA compliance and have worked through many, many issues along those lines, but also trust in the information and who do patients in their patient life, but also in their consumer life trust and go to for information. So bringing the drug development piece, one of the things that's bothered me for a long, long time is this, which is how we approach medicine and how we approach product development, which is pretty much left to right. We take discoveries and we push them out into the clinical trial world, which I think we've discussed is a very skewed kind of view of the world of what patients are like, because we clean them up a lot and treat them like laboratory animals. Can't be pregnant, can't have any other coexisting conditions, they can't have been treated before, which reflects nothing about how these products are actually going to get used in the real world. We put the product on the market, and I can tell you, working within the FDA, the big joke was that the day of the drug approval is the best day of that drug's life, and everything falls apart thereafter. Because you had your great efficacy in your clinical trial, and then your product goes to market, and your efficacy starts dropping down to about 50% across all the major categories of drugs that we're currently using every day in treating people. We get it to patients. They do all kinds of stuff with these products, and they do all kinds of things with how they use these products and all the other things they combine with them. And we never stop to bother to ask, what's going on out there, and how can we reverse engineer to drive smarter point-of-care interventions and drive smarter product development? Instead, we keep going back to the well and thinking that scientists are going to come up with a great new pathway, the great new discovery, and we don't incorporate that stuff on the right. Second thing is, as I said, we treat our patients like human subjects, and they're not human subjects. They're co-researchers, because we really need to understand what's going on with them, even in the clinical trial space. I did a lot of trials on very subjective endpoints. I can tell you they stink. People do all kinds of things in allergy trials. If you ever want to know why allergy products don't work that well, do a trial in allergies and look at journal data, because it's awful and because we haven't really figured out how to collect the information in a way and how to understand what's meaningful to patients. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we get patients into the equation, empower them with decision-making authority, not just at point of care, but as part of the equation and how we think about product development, and how we actually begin to use that information to stratify them, not just based on their genetics, but on patient-reported outcomes, their behavior, and a big area that I think is lacking, which is point of care, real-world disease definition. We call everything type 2 diabetes. There's 100 diseases in there. And at the end of the day, I really think where we're going to wind up is with product development that includes wrappers around a healthcare innovation, wrappers around a drug, that include digital engagement, which will be social media app, but also that are more data-driven, and I don't want to lose this point of family focus. So we can't lose this component in this big data discussion about sensors and bringing data in, about the social components of health. Health is a social enterprise. It is social in your very, what I call trusted network of your friends and family. It's social in your trying to come up with a decision with a physician that's very personal and important to you. And it's social with respect to how you're taking ownership of your health in your consumer life and in your community. And the community has a big impact in how you actually will engage in your healthcare and defining your healthcare solutions. I put this slide up. This is a study from the Pew Research Center, and the only thing I want you to focus on is the top line, which is where do people seek information? Not just patients, but their caregivers. And the caregivers are an incredibly important part of healthcare. Caregivers, unpaid caregivers, are delivering 90% of healthcare outside the clinic in the US. They're a really important part of the equation that's been overlooked. And they happen to be that friends and family network where a lot of information is being exchanged in a trusted way. So the last time you had a health issue, did you get information or care or support from who? Your family doctor, but second on that list and almost as frequently, friends and family, and then others who have the same conditions. We have to recognize that the doctor is not the only person in the equation. So one of the things we thought about when starting the company that we have is how do we learn from other big data efforts? Certainly retail has spent a lot of time. I happen to be married to someone who spent a lot of time looking at elections and politics, and we want to discuss that further. Please chat with him at dinner tonight. But essentially they spent, in the last two presidential elections in our country, spent a lot of time thinking about how do we take data and understand sentiment, and how do we understand where people are? And I want to, where we've been working to apply some of those ideas of taking data in and then providing information out in a micro-targeted way that moves people to do things, kind of like what you were talking about this morning with text messaging, but on in a different sort of what I call ecosystem that I'll explain in a minute. So we can take engaged users and a rich data set and combine and create content that's dynamic and personalized for the user in order to help them develop a better care plan. And a critical component of this, we decided at the get-go, was the family. So being able to create platforms, not a Fitbit or a solution, but a platform that allows you to incorporate multiple solutions, could be a home blood pressure monitoring to a patient education class, but with the ability to do profile management so that there is a shared interface between the patient and the patient's caregiver and the healthcare provider, and everybody is looking at the same data and working from the same page using a cloud-based architecture. So we went at this, and we've been doing work in China, doing a lot of work in the US. We're actually working on a large project with the Cleveland Clinic on brain health development that's being underwritten by Caesars Foundation. And there's a really interesting intersection between the casino world and brain health going on in Las Vegas that I'd be happy to talk to people about. But this is an example of how we've been implementing it in an underserved community to attack type 2 diabetes. This community has the highest rate in our country. 37% of people in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas are type 2 diabetics. And they are an underserved, poor community, average family income of $17,000 a year. What we've been doing is basically powering people where we have an interface that allows for profile management put in the hands of community health workers in the University of Texas so they can access data in real time on a per profile basis, push and pull content to and from the patient, and at the same time, the patient's home caregiver is getting access to that information, and they become the advocate for improving health. So now what we've essentially created is the ability to link in any of the sensors, any of the home monitoring tools, in an interface that allows for team-based management around the patient. It also gives us 360-degree data around the patient, because we believe the observed data, that is the data that's coming from the home caregiver, is really important and maybe a richer source of information about patient status than the patient's experience data themselves. So I'm going to just end by talking about the value of big data. This is from a McKinsey report on big data in healthcare. But the idea is that we have to not just look at activity and claims cost data in the upper left quadrant and EMR data and, of course, our clinical trials data. We have to bring in what's going on in the real world with respect to patient behavior and sentiment data. And then the integration of this is really going to be critical for coming up with the next generation healthcare solutions. And that's it.